And now I have the pleasure, a real personal pleasure, to invite UBC alumnus Sharman King to join me on stage for a conversation reflecting on his experience at UBC and over the course of his career. Sharman graduated from UBC with a Bachelor of Music degree in the class of 1970, as I said. His lifelong career as a musician has been very diverse, playing trombone in big bands, club bands, the Vancouver Opera Orchestra, the Edmonton Symphony Orchestra, teaching at the University of Calgary, and more recently here at UBC in his retirement, so to speak. He's been a recording studio musician with Olivia Newton-John and Procol Harum, many others, of course, as well. He has toured with jazz greats Buddy Rich and especially Tommy Banks, and has performed with singers such as Frank Sinatra, Tony Bennett, Ray Charles, Sarah Vaughan, Tom Jones, and BC's own Diana Krall. In short, he knows a thing or two about the music business. He also knows a thing or two about business, having founded a very successful bookstore business that grew to sustain multiple outlets. Having retired from the book business, but not from the music business, he now serves on several business boards and has also served the UBC Library as a member of its advisory board. In short, Sharman King has been busy since graduating from UBC in 1970, and he knows the value of a music degree. Please join me in greeting Sharman King. Thank you so much. Thank you. I've got some questions here, which Sharman's already seen, except for a few of them. Sharman, I want to begin by evoking for students here a sense of history, to understand the roots of our sense of community. When you graduated in 1970, the building was just 2 years old. It's now pretty well worn. It's got a lot of history in it, but it was brand new. In fact, Sharman told me just earlier today that he wired these outlets that are here on the stage. He was a builder, not only a shaker. So tell me, what was the campus like when you first came here? What were the classes like, the students, the professors? What was it like?
Okay, when I first came here, it was the last year of the music school being in what we called the old building, which was became the Arts 1 building over by the education department. The school was very new. The first graduating class had graduated a year previously in 65, 60, around there.
63,
it's interesting, there were 25 roughly graduates, 2 of whom have Orders of Canada, so they did well right from the beginning. The school at the time was new. The university hired a head to get it established, get it going, and they modeled themselves after University of Southern California. They brought largely faculty from USC or people that had been associated with USC, and the program paralleled USC in that there was a theory class and a history class that were historically linked. So in first year history, first year theory, you studied really up to common practice period, and then second year was common practice period. So in first year you learned pre-Renaissance music until Christmas, and then Renaissance music from Christmas till the end of that year. And you did it both in ear training, in theory, and in history. So it paralleled very well. And that program really worked quite well. And what we have now is very much a descendant of that in many ways. The school was very small. There was no entrance requirement. So in my case, I'd had first year in a math physics stream. That's really where my talents were. And during that first year, I heard a recording, a Frank Sinatra recording with a bass trombone. And I asked my dad, I grew up in Trail in the interior. I asked my dad what that instrument is, and he said, well, it's a bass trombone. So I bought one. He was an engineer, so he wasn't really thrilled with what came next. After first year in science, I applied to the School of Music, and luckily there was no entrance requirement at the time. As long as you could get into UBC, you could get into into here. And I took to it like a duck to water. And there was really good opportunities here because it was so small and you got to play everything. The formative things for me as I went through my time in the school were the opportunities, first of all, to study with some really formative teachers. For me, the most formative one was Cortland Hultberg, a legendary theory teacher, and I had him in first year, and he really changed my life. It was very good, and he ran the booth, and so I started working in the booth, and we have a legacy of people who have worked in the booth and have learned different ways to think and do things, and that was really a formative part of my first year at UBC. The other formative part of my first year at UBC was for a language requirement. I took a computer science course. I learned to code in Fortran. And while you might think that has nothing to do with anything, well, it was so important because it was a different way to think. And one of the things we all have to think about as musicians is that we deal with an abstract notation for a concrete result or a concrete notation for an abstract result. We go both ways, and guess what? That's what you do when you code in a computer. So it's, at the time we did our programming on punch cards, it was certainly a lot different than it is now, but nevertheless the way of thinking was the same. And I have, again, Cortland Hultberg to thank for that. We'll talk about him more later, but it was a very good start. Very small school, very cohesive group of colleagues, and everybody knew everybody, and we didn't have the divergent streams that we have now. So it was a smaller in number, smaller in concept school.
More reliant on one another, I imagine, in certain ways.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. You've succeeded in multiple careers, which you've run kind of in parallel, or maybe counterpoint is the better word. How did your study of music help you in discovering other opportunities or succeeding in them?
Okay. I guess if there's a theme to what I'm going to say next, it is going to be the unpredictability of what comes next or what comes in your future. At this stage, when you're graduating, you're all thinking, well, what am I going to do next and what's my career path? And I'm here to tell you, it ain't gonna happen. It just never works out as you plan. So I'm gonna very quickly go through elements of my 50 years in professional music with an eye to what changes and what you couldn't possibly have foreseen. And the underlying theme here is that what you learn as a music student applies to so many other things. You have no idea how it's going to work out. For years since I've come back, I've been back teaching at UBC for 5 years, and I've been an ardent proponent of our school being the best possible pre-law or pre-med degree, because we work in close quarters with people that we may or may not like, but we have to make it work. We work in real time. It's right or wrong when you play music, so it's a binary. It's the right note or it's the wrong note. It's in tune or ain't. So we have so many things that we can translate to other fields. So even whatever happens to you in music will have application in other fields. So when I came here, I had switched from science, and I decided, well, maybe I'll be a school music teacher and I'll learn how to work the bass trombone. After my first year, in fact, before my first year was over, I got hired to play euphonium and bass trombone in the Expo Band in Montreal. And that was a marvelous opportunity because it was 5 hours a day with a thing on my face, so I learned how to work the trombone pretty well. Took lessons from the bass trombone player in the Montreal Symphony. My teacher here was wonderful, Jimmy Coombs, who was a British player. He'd played in the Ted Heath Band and he played in all the London orchestras, and he'd emigrated here, so he was a very good teacher for me. But I worked in Montreal and I worked at Expo, and then I got a job working at night in a Mafia nightclub. The show was called Sexpo 67, so you can sort of figure out what that was about. And I came back to school, and then when I came back, they were in this new building, so that was thrilling. And then immediately when I got back here, I had mentors in Cortland Hultberg and Dave Robbins, who was a trombone instructor, the lead trombone instructor here, and Ian McDougall, who at the time was a working trombone player and shortly became a master's student here. And they took me under their wing and they got me working. So the first time I worked in Vancouver really was Dave decided, oh, we'll get this guy some work. So between Christmas and New Year's of the first year in this building, he gave me a television show, which was 7 trombones plus the Vancouver Symphony. So there were 10 trombone players in one television show. That hasn't happened since. There was the Ice Capades, and there was a New Year's Eve radio show, which if any of you corner me after, I have some good stories to tell, and that New Year's Eve radio show was good. But one of our other graduates, George Laverock, was the producer of it, and he was usually a pretty good producer, but in this case, he had us rehearse until 4 in the afternoon, then we went live on radio across Canada at 8. Now, what was he thinking, giving a bunch of commercial musicians 4 hours off between a rehearsal and the show with the Devonshire Hotel beer parlor just down the street? So it was a hilarious show, and I have a tape of the second half of it, which is very enjoyable. Anyway, so I went through my music school here. I played in the National Youth Orchestra. I really still intended to be a music teacher. And then when I was getting close to graduation, Dave Robbins gave me, as this is mentorship, he gave me my choice of going on the road with Harry James, who was a trumpet player, or Buddy Rich, who was a drummer. So I took Buddy Rich and I went out with that band. I was there for 4 months, 34 states, played 3 major jazz festivals. It was just a great credential and a lot of fun. I came back to Vancouver thinking, well, I'm going to be just great. Now, this is to do with the unpredictability. And I got back here, and I have to preface it by saying, with Buddy Rich, our checks came from a company called WGD Incorporated. That stood for World's Greatest Drummer Incorporated. So when I got back here, I got a job playing in a banjo club. It was called Your Father's Mustache, and the band was called the World's Worst Banjo Band. So I went from best or greatest to the best. And that was 2 banjos and a trombone and a tuba. I was the tuba player, and we drank beer there. We had a lot of beer, and then I'd worked there almost a year. And the University of Calgary called and asked if I would come and teach music theory. Now, where does it say at that time, drunk bass trombone player gets job as theory teacher? Well, first of all, Hultberg's teaching had been so good. And one of the lessons for you guys is when you start teaching, you will always teach in the form of your most influential teacher. So I was a very successful theory teacher because I just did what Hultberg had done, and it worked really well. It was fantastic for me. But they hired me because they needed somebody who could teach theory, low brass, electronic music, run a stage band, and was Canadian. So there wasn't a lot of people like that in the country, so I got this job, and I was sort of green at it. I didn't know that a 27-hour teaching load was pretty heavy, so I went there, and it was fun. I did that for 2 years. During that 2 years, I got connected. First of all, I played in the Edmonton Symphony. They needed a bass trombone player, and again, if you corner me after, I'll tell you the story of my bass trombone audition for the Edmonton Symphony, which is hilarious, and it's folklore in trombone land. Anyway, I started working in that orchestra, and then I got hooked up with a musician in Edmonton named Tommy Banks, a keyboard player, a piano player, and we ended up doing, we figured, 300 to 400 hours of internationally syndicated television. A huge body of work that we did. And it was really an amazing thing. Now I have to tell you about Tom, is that Tom has a grade 10 education. That's as far as he got, because he got busy as a musician. He's a brilliant man, he just died. He Churchillian scholar. Lawyers consult him on contract writing because his skills of concise English were phenomenal. He was really influential to me. So we stayed hooked up, and over the next 10 years when I started working as a musician, we did shows back and forth. One of the shows that we did was, I quit my job. I have to go back and I say I quit my job in the unpredictability part. Ian McDougall, who had 5 acres in White Rock, he phoned me and he said, they're moving to Toronto, do I want to rent his place? I said yes, and I went out to the university that day and quit my job at the university and came back here. And in the course of doing that, I didn't really burn any bridges, but I stayed connected with Edmonton, but I was back here. But one of the things in Edmonton is we had a TV series that, again, we rehearsed until 8 o'clock, and then we did it live to tape at 8 o'clock on Saturday nights. And so again, 4 hours off for the musicians, and at the campus at U of A, there was no place to drink, except there was a faculty club. So I came out to UBC and I talked to the head at the time and I said, well, I need a job. And my didactic purpose in that job was, if I got a job here, I would get a faculty club card here, and they were reciprocal, and then we'd have a place to go and socialize between the rehearsal and the show. So, it was just that simple. So I came here and I taught from the mid-70s till the mid-90s. In the mid-90s, I ended up with a cancer situation, and I was really busy and something had to go, so that was the end of UBC until we got out of our business and UBC invited me back. But I had no plans for any of this to happen. And then once I was back here and working and teaching at UBC, life just happened and opportunities followed opportunities. But during that time, the variety television shows that we were making, and we say of that time as musicians, the streets were paved with gold because the financial returns were unbelievable. It was so good. But that was stopping. So with my partner Tom, we thought, well, we get along well together. Let's do a business together. And at the time, Tom had a business partner, Phil Schrag, who used to be his drummer, and who was the Deputy Minister of Small Business Development in the Alberta government. So we talked about doing a business, and we came up with a business plan. We would buy a spring in the Rockies and a tank truck, and we would truck water into Calgary and Edmonton, and we would manufacture ice cubes and sell the ice cubes to bars, because drinks didn't taste very good, because this is before bottled water, and that just the water wasn't that good. So this was our plan. And then Phil, the third partner, was in Toronto, and he saw a store called the Book Barn, which purported to be the world's largest bookstore. And he said, this is what we should do. His holy grail was to find a business where a small business person could control the market in Western Canada. So they did it in Edmonton, and then in the summer of 1980, Tom phoned me and he said, mortgage your house, we're going in the book business. And I just paid off my house. So I mortgaged the house, and we opened the first book warehouse here in Vancouver. We staffed it almost entirely from the music school. Whenever I needed employees, I just would put up a note. And one of my favorite statistics is at one time the entire trombone section of the Quebec Symphony Orchestra was ex-book warehouse employees. So that was pretty good. And then I just, the book business took off, and the music business, especially the recording business, dropped off. And again, there's no way to predict any of this as goes on, but you learn things from everything that's gone on before, and it works out really well, but not in a predictable way. If you had told me when I was getting out of high school that I would end up with a career largely as a recording musician, I would have thought that was a preposterous notion. And the same thing with the business career. So now I'm at the end of it, and looking back, it's fabulous, but you couldn't have charted this path through, and it's really the important thing that we're saying to you now. You ain't sure what it's going to be, but it's going to be good if you apply intelligence. It doesn't really matter so much what your decision is as how you react to the results of that decision.
Everybody thinks that the change is happening faster now than ever before, but you've described constant change, not just in your career, but in all the opportunities that were available. So the TV stuff came along. That was a new format. It didn't exist before. It lasted for a few years. It was a gold mine, like you said. But that format went out of practice, and other things came along. So constant change. And I think you've told us how you managed it. But I have a question about improvisation, because it's part of what you do as a musician, but it's part of what you've clearly done in your career. And when you're improvising, you have to have a relationship with the people you're working with. So tell us a little bit about how you assess the character of your collaborators.
Okay, interesting question. I still work as a musician doing good things. We just finished the opera festival, where Eugene Onegin was one of the high points of my musical life. But last night I was working in the Legion at Alma and Broadway, working for the Door in a band called Wow. And it's a 10-piece improvising band, but all of the music is written by Jack Fulton and Paul Ruland. Over the course of that band, they wrote 240 charts. It's a huge body of work. Paul Ruland, especially, his music copying looks like the best thing you've ever seen, and he could write counterpoint onto parts without necessarily writing a score. It was a very good thing. The thing about it is that the players in that band are largely the players that we've been together with for 30, 40, 50 years. We all know each other. We get along well together, so you build a community, and that community goes along. People die at the end, new people come in. But one of the big things is your stylistic flexibility, because the styles of music change imperceptibly year to year until something big happens, but over the course of decades, they change incredibly. So one of the most useful things I learned was in first year theory, Renaissance music performance practices, and how to discern what was musical in Renaissance music. Now, coming from Trail and having a background in an Italian community band didn't really prepare one for that eventuality. But once you learn how to hear what's musical in a style, you get a flexibility for working in that in the future. So this group of musicians, we were largely, when I started, it was sort of the end of the swing era and rock and roll was happening, but about 5 years into it, something came along called disco. And disco killed so many of the old swing musicians because they couldn't play in time and fast enough with it, especially with headphones and in studios. It was a technical problem. But the community evolved because we had to evolve as a community to be able to record this music competitively in Vancouver. There had to be a reason to come to Vancouver to do these projects. And we evolved very well, but in a very cohesive way. Everyone got along well, and it's thrilling to look back. The band last night, there's people in there I've worked with for 50 years. It's so good, and we're still doing the same thing, a bit different, but as very good friends.
You mentioned Cortland Hultberg, the teacher, faculty member here, and Tommy Banks, recently deceased, but Senator Tommy Banks. So they were important mentors and friends for you. Tell us a little bit about them and about other mentors in your life.
Sure. Dave Robbins was a violinist. He was the concertmaster in the Cincinnati Conservatory in the late 30s. And the war came along, and he was going to be drafted, and he played euphonium. His dad was a Midwestern band director. So Dave went into the Marine Band in Washington, D.C., and he very quickly decided this was not for him. But he was a well-trained musician, so he started to write arrangements for the President's Own Dance Band, which was the dance band part of the Marines. And he was very successful at that and did that throughout the war. Then at the end of the war, he became Harry James' music director and traveled all over the place with Harry. And during those travels, he ended up marrying a dancer from Vancouver. Trombone players and dancers seem to get together quite often. And he came here, and I would, just to deflect the question a little bit, we've always had a very good recording industry here. And I put the blame for that, or the credit for that, solely at Cortland Hultberg and Dave Robbins, because they were teaching at UBC, and Hultberg's choir, the chamber singers, was a 12-voice choir that sang only before 1600 and after 1900. Everyone had to be able to sing with no vibrato, sight sing impeccably. Well, those singers became a company called Griffiths Gibson Productions, which was a jingle production house. One of the early jingles, which was for Datsun cars, Datsun was Nissan,
yeah,
you know
became
now.
Nissan, yeah.
Doreen Oak, who you know around here, sang on one of those, and she made enough money that she bought a car. It was a golden opportunity. But to compete in that market in North America, we needed recording studios. So because of Dave being Mr. CBC at the time and really developing a lot of players, Don Thompson would be a very good example, but there were just tons of players that went through his tutelage there and his teaching here, and Cortland Hultberg. Between those guys, we ended up with our first good recording studio, which was Little Mountain Sound, 201 West 7th. The first session there was all the jingles for Pontiac cars in North America for a whole year. So that was a very tense day in that shakedown of that studio, but it was all because of Cortland and all because of Dave Robbins. You have no idea. And you have no idea really who's going to be influential in the future now, except that you can be quite sure, because UBC is a preeminent music training place here. It's going to be you guys in some form. So the education you're getting, again, you don't know where it's going, but you know it's going to be good. And you're getting the tools to go wherever things take you and you take you.
You've given lots of advice for students. Do you have any advice for faculty or for the school?
Sure. He knows I'm passionate about that. I really believe that the school has to have a philosophy and has to have a direction and has to evolve. And I know from having been in lots of situations where people have tried to change things by blowing things up and then starting new. That seldom works. But what you have to do is evolve with a vision, and you have to evolve with a philosophy, and you have to evolve with a desire to give the students the best that they can have. It's natural in universities, every faculty, it doesn't matter if it's music or what. Once somebody has a faculty position, then the university teaching game becomes a different thing. It becomes the structure of the university, it becomes the structure of your tenure, it becomes the structure of who gets chosen next to come into the school, and these are all crucial things, and I would really, as I am in the absolute twilight of my stuff, I'm the oldest, most junior person working at UBC, is that the students have to come first. The progress of the students, the possibilities of the students, the training of the students, the personal development of the students, how the students learn from the role models that the faculty is. These are the things that are really worth doing. Now, there's some evident people here who are really good role models. I'm going to pick on somebody who's not a faculty member, but Margaret in the office. She's so important to how the place functions, and she knows people's business, and she's just there, and if you keep her as a role model for how you're going to run your life and how you're going to be helpful to people while doing your job, that's a fantastic skill. That's a real people skill that will reflect on your own development and greatly accelerate your own development. So if I have advice for the future of the school is keep on what you're doing, but know where you're going, knowing that things are going to change and that the hires for now are the determinant of the future success.
Excellent. Thank you for saying that. All of that. One last question. I hear you've bought and sold trombones, at least one of them. Was it a profitable venture?
It's Shires?
Yeah.
Okay, I like pawn shops. I can't stay out of secondhand stores and pawn shops. And you have to understand that in my basement I have 10, count them 10, bass trombones, minus one that I've sent to my other formative teacher, Dick Herbs, in New Orleans. But in a pawn shop in East Vancouver, there was the Shires bass trombone. Now, Shires is sort of the flavor of the month for bass trombones, and it was in there for $3,500. And you have to know that that's an absurd, well, it's probably a market price, but that's an absurd price. So you don't take anything that they say as gospel. So anyway, I knew this trombone had to be stolen, had to be. So I ended up buying it for $700, and then we learned I asked for a year, and I put notices in all the trombone discussion groups, and nobody seemed to know. Nobody came forward. But then we had a session to welcome the new trombone players in the symphony. We had a playing session, and I asked there, and then Gordon Sherry stood up and said, "Oh, that's somebody's trombone." Well, the somebody didn't want the trombone back because there'd been an insurance settlement. It was just going to confuse things. So I sent it away. It got gone out of the country, and that's gone. But I still have the very first bass trombone I bought, which is a latch, a German trombone, made in around 1953. We use it in the opera orchestra when we play Mozart. We play on an alto trombone, a small tenor, like a commercial tenor trombone, and I use this very small but beautiful bass trombone. So, if never sell something, keep it because they'll come in useful. That trombone I bought back twice. Sold it and bought it back twice. Pretty good.
That's the one I was thinking about. Sharman, thank you for sharing your wonderful humor, your intelligence, your brilliance, your experience. There'll be chances to speak with Sharman in the lobby afterwards, so please take advantage of that. Sharman, thank you.